Welcome to this presentation titled Significance is a Decision, the Logic of P-Values in Science. My name is Luke Egan, and I'm presenting this on behalf of the NeuRA Research Quality Committee. I have experience as a lecturer and course convener on statistics and research methods, but there will be no appeals to authority in this video. This presentation is intended for a wide academic audience, including students, early or mid-career researchers, and established scientists. We will review the logic of p-values with the aim of deterring researchers from spinning their results. Spin is a shonky practice in which researchers tout supposed effects or trends when the p-values do not fall below the threshold for significance. There is a pressing need to address spin as part of the broader response to a recent crisis that has shaken numerous scientific fields, including medicine and psychology. Known as the reproducibility crisis or replication crisis, it became evident when numerous supposedly sound theories were not corroborated in multiple attempted replications of the original studies. The replication crisis is not some minor internal controversy within the affected disciplines. It has been a major blow to their credibility, which could lead to funding cuts and other blowback in the future if we don't address the crisis properly today. Indeed, the replication crisis has already reached the attention of the general public through websites with mass appeal, such as Wikipedia, as well as sites that cater to those with an interest in medicine or psychology specifically. The crisis has also been covered by a number of mainstream media outlets, including publications for a general audience, as well as publications for those with a particular interest in science. Here in Australia, the crisis has also come to the attention of the federal government, whose behavioural economics team covered it on their podcast. And perhaps most importantly, scientists themselves have acknowledged the crisis, as this paper by Baker has pointed out. So, what's being done about the crisis? Well, here at Neuroscience Research Australia, the Research Quality Committee has created a simple, generic tool to assess the quality of published studies, the Quality Output Checklist and Content Assessment, or QOCA. The QOCA is an 11-item measure that covers the areas of research transparency, design, analysis, and reporting practices. Question 11 of the QOCA deals with the issue of spin, asking whether the study in question makes claims for the importance or significance of results associated with a p-value greater than or equal to 0.05 or whatever the stated threshold may have been. That is, misleading spin of reported results. For context, the Research Quality Committee has already produced a separate series of videos covering the overall QOCA, including question 11. So, why did we feel the need to make the video you're currently watching, specifically on the topic of spin? Because spin is the only form of research malpractice that is still defended by a handful of scientists. This can be attributed to a misunderstanding of the logic of p-values and statistical significance. Let's begin with a quick summary of this logic. Then we'll look at a simple example, a coin-flipping example, to illustrate. Okay, this is the logic in question. From the theory being tested, the researcher deduces that a specific effect should be evident in the data to be collected. This deduction is expressed as the hypothesis, H1, that the effect will be observed. However, it is known that even purely random processes, whose outcomes are all equally likely, can produce apparently non-random sequences, misleading us into believing that there is a genuine effect at play. Therefore, we cannot assume that our results are not due merely to randomness or noise in the data. Indeed, we assume the opposite. We assume that there are no systematic effects at play. This assumption is called the null hypothesis, H0. But, although we start by assuming the null hypothesis, our aim is to gather enough evidence to falsify it. This is in keeping with the logic of the scientific method, whereby knowledge advances through falsification of one or more competing theories. After assuming the null hypothesis, we can calculate how unlikely our observed results would be if the null hypothesis really was true. If our results are sufficiently unlikely given the null, we have sufficient grounds to doubt the null and therefore to reject it in favor of the conclusion that a genuine effect does exist. But how do we define the concept of sufficiently unlikely? Well, in medicine, psychology, and many other fields of science, researchers conform to the standard that sufficiently unlikely means a less than 5% chance, or a probability value, p-value, smaller than 0.05. And some disciplines, such as genetics and physics, tend to use even stricter thresholds. When the obtained p-value falls below the designated threshold, the results are deemed statistically significant. This threshold is simply a matter of convention, and the individual researcher is free to set the threshold for their own research as they see fit. In setting the threshold, the researcher decides what level of unlikelihood will count as the minimum needed to reject the null hypothesis. If the minimum degree of unlikelihood is not observed, there are insufficient grounds to doubt the null, and so the null is retained, at least for now. To reiterate, each researcher can set the threshold as they see fit, but they cannot violate their own standards of evidence. This point brings me to the slogan of this presentation. Significance is a decision, or less succinctly, it pertains to a decision. Significance is not synonymous with p-values. P-values form a quantitative metric for measuring the unlikelihood of our results, assuming the null. By metric, I simply mean a system for measuring something, in this case, measuring unlikelihood. However, while p-values are a metric, statistical significance is not. Rather, significance is a binary decision taken by the researcher, whereby they declare their results to be either significant or non-significant. No hypothesis, null or otherwise, can be partly or marginally retained or rejected. Therefore, expressions such as marginally significant and other forms of spin are logically inadmissible. Significance is not a metric. It is not a quantity whose magnitude can be marginal as opposed to slight or moderate or extreme. To illustrate the difference between a metric and a decision, one may say that a given medicine partly cures an illness, but one cannot say that one partly believes in the curative effect. Whatever this effect may be, either you believe it exists or you don't. To illustrate, imagine we're playing a coin flipping game. Heads, I win. Tails, you win. You agree to play because the assumption is that the contest is fair, that the coin flipping is a purely random process whose outcomes are both equally likely. We play a few rounds. First flip, heads, I win. Second flip, heads again, I win again. Third flip, heads yet again. Suddenly, you interrupt. How do I know the coin isn't biased? What if it's weighted to land on heads every time? I counter. But even an unbiased coin could produce a run of 3 heads or 3 tails in a row. In fact, it is theoretically possible for a fair coin to land on heads thousands of times in a row. But you won't back down. There must be a certain number of rounds after which, if I haven't won a single flip, even you would doubt the coin was fair. And I agree. Indeed, there is. But I will graciously allow you to stipulate the minimum number. You comply. If the coin gives me a losing streak with a less than 5% chance of occurrence, assuming the coin is fair, then we'll conclude it's actually biased. With this new standard of evidence in place, we agree to play a fresh match. First flip, heads, I win. Second flip, heads again. Third flip, heads yet again. Fourth flip, another heads. I see you growing red in the face. Surely the coin is biased. 4 heads in a row is rather unlikely. But is it sufficiently unlikely? Let's calculate the p-values. A single losing flip has a 50% chance. 2 in a row, a 25% chance. 3 in a row, a 12.5% chance. And 4 in a row, a 6.25% chance. 6.25%. Is that less than 5%? No, not quite. Your losing streak of 4 rounds has a p-value of 0.0625, or 6.25%, which does not fall below the agreed threshold of 5%. However, if the next flip comes up heads, the p-value for your 5-round losing streak will be 0.03125, or 3.125%, that is, below the threshold. So, we flip the coin for the 5th time, but it's tails. You've won a round, finally. But your face is still red. What's wrong? To answer that question, I'll let this illustration speak for itself. Okay. So, we've covered the logic of p-values and statistical significance, and we've illustrated it, along with an example of spin, with the coin flipping example. Now, before concluding this presentation, I'll cover 4 possible objections and their refutations. Objection 1. But what if we just miss a crucial discovery by being too strict with the threshold? Refutation. For an effect to count as a worthwhile discovery, it must be of a minimum size. The minimum effect size that you would consider meaningful is something that you must determine in advance, so that you can power your study to detect such effects with a p-value below the minimum threshold. Objection 2. The p-value threshold is arbitrary anyway, so it doesn't matter if we stretch the definition slightly. Refutation. The concept of a minimum standard of evidence is not arbitrary. Minimum means minimum. If you accept that there can be degrees of evidential strength, then you must accept that there is a minimum level of evidence below which we must conclude that there is no evidence at all, or nothing that can be distinguished from random noise. The fact that we must operationalize this evidential standard, sometimes in the form of arbitrary conventions, does not license researchers to ignore the standard. Furthermore, researchers only ever stretch the threshold in one direction, that is, in favor of rejecting the null and corroborating their own hypotheses. This not only demonstrates systematic bias, but also flies in the face of numerous warnings from respected methodologists that the conventional threshold of 0.05 is far too lenient in the first place. Many recommend a stricter cutoff of 0.01 or even 0.005. Here is one example of a paper that recommends lowering the threshold to 0.005, and here is an example of a paper that recommends a threshold of 0.001. Objection 3. This is just semantics. The phrase marginally significant is just a synonym for p equals 0.06. Refutation. As mentioned earlier, p-values are a metric, whereas significance involves a decision. Of course, you are free to treat the terminology of significance as merely synonymous with p-values. But if you do so, you literally won't be able to decide whether a coin is fair or biased, let alone whether a scientific theory is false or not. You need a threshold for decisions. Objection 4. These considerations only apply to certain statistical frameworks, for example, Neiman-Pearson versus Fisher. Refutation. The concept of a minimum standard of evidence transcends any particular statistical framework. Even in qualitative research, it is possible to specify in advance what would constitute adequate evidence for one's hypothesis, and then to stick to that threshold. In conclusion, p-values are a metric, but statistical significance is a decision. The null hypothesis is either retained provisionally or rejected in favor of an alternative hypothesis. There is no in-between. Spin is not only misleading, but also logically inadmissible. Therefore, expressions such as marginally significant are conceptually incoherent. Finally, the p-value threshold represents the minimum level of evidence required. The concept of minimum is key. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll finish with the reference list, and I hope you've learned something from this video. All the best with your future research from all of us here at the Research Quality Committee at NeuRA.